Invisible Radiation, The Secret Story of Mayak and the Kyshtym Disaster. Part 1 on the city that was not supposed to exist. There are some disasters that announce themselves with fire. There are others that arrive with the roar of collapsing steel, with shattered windows, with smoke blackening the sky. Those are the tragedies people remember easily. Those are the ones that leave ruins dramatic enough for history books. But there is another kind of catastrophe, the kind that slips into a river without a sound, the kind that settles into grass, clings to boots, hides in drinking water, and drifts invisibly through open windows at night, the kind that does not need flames to destroy a life, the kind that does not need to be seen. This is the story of one of those disasters. It begins not with an explosion, but with silence. After the Second World War, the world was no longer divided by oceans or borders alone. It was divided by fear. The United States had shown what atomic power could do in war, and the Soviet Union understood the message immediately. In the new age that followed, power belonged to the nation that could build the bomb faster, produce more plutonium, and hide its weaknesses better than its enemies. In that race, secrecy became as important as science. And deep in the Ural region, far from foreign eyes, the Soviet state built one of the most secret places on Earth, the Mayak complex, in the closed city known by its coded name, Chelyabinsk 40. The site was established in the late 1940s as part of the Soviet weapons program, and even its mailing system reflected the secrecy, with workers using a post office box rather than a public city name. If you had looked for that city on a map, you would not have found it. If you had asked the wrong question in the wrong room, people might have gone quiet. The city existed, but only in a controlled way. It had workers, engineers, cars, walls, reactors, laboratories, schedules, schools, apartments, and stores. Children grew up there. People fell in love there. Families celebrated birthdays there. But at the same time, it lived like a ghost. It was a city the state needed, but did not want the world to know about. And that was the first layer of the tragedy. Anything hidden that deeply can begin to believe it is untouchable. The people who were sent there were not all villains. Many were brilliant scientists. Many believed they were defending their country. Some saw themselves as builders of the future, men and women standing at the frontier of modern power. They were told their work was essential. They were told history depended on them. They were told speed mattered. Results mattered. Delay was dangerous. Failure was unthinkable. In that kind of atmosphere, caution becomes easy to postpone. Mayak was built quickly because the Soviet Union believed it had no time to lose. The reactors and processing facilities needed to produce plutonium, and they needed to do it now. Safety systems, waste handling, environmental consequences, long-term contamination, those were not ignored because nobody knew they existed. They were pushed aside because they stood in the path of urgency. The bomb was the goal. The waste was a problem for later. And so later began to pile up. Not far from the secret city, the land followed an older rhythm. Villages stood beside rivers that had existed long before the Cold War, long before fences, code names, and military maps. Families along the Techa River lived as river families always had. They drew water from it. They washed clothes in it. They bathed children in it. They fished in it. They let cattle drink from it. The river was not scenery. It was part of the body of everyday life. Then the waste began to enter it. Between the late 1940s and the mid-1950s, radioactive waste from the Mayak complex was released into the Techa River system, contaminating villages downstream. Later analyses and AI material describe the region around Mayak as one of the most contaminated nuclear sites in the world, with very large historical releases to the local environment. No siren warned the villagers. No official stood in the square and said, "Do not drink from the river." No school teacher gathered children and told them that the water had changed. The water looked the same. It reflected the same sky. It moved with the same current. It glittered in morning light exactly as it always had. And that is what made the danger so perfect. Radiation does not need drama. It does not need a villain to knock on your door. It enters quietly, sometimes through the same ordinary motions that define a human life, lifting a bucket, rinsing your face, washing the shirt, kneeling by the bank while your children laugh nearby. A war can make you afraid of planes, tanks, soldiers, and bombs. But how do you fear a river that still looks beautiful? At first, The villagers did not understand. Why would they? The state told them nothing. If animals behaved strangely, if someone fell ill, if a child's body became weak, if skin changed, if fatigue became common, if headaches lingered, if some families buried more than they should have, these things could be blamed on anything. Bad luck, hard winters, poor diet, infection, exhaustion. The one explanation people were not given was the one that mattered most. There were stories, of course. There are always stories where secrecy rules. Some said the river was no longer safe. Some whispered that people from the facility knew more than they admitted. Others dismissed such talk, because what else could they do? To accept that the land itself had become dangerous was to accept a truth too large to survive emotionally. Most people cannot abandon a river, a field, a home, and a village all at once, not without certainty, not without explanation, and not without somewhere else to go. So life continued. Boys still threw stones into the water. Women still scrubbed pots on the bank. Farmers still stepped into the mud. Some nights the sky glowed with the colour of sunset over the Urals, and nothing in that beauty suggested poison. Nature rarely announces when it has been wounded by man. Inside Mayak, the machinery of the nuclear state kept moving. Plutonium production, chemical processing, storage, transport, everything existed inside a system where information was compartmentalized and mistakes could be buried almost as carefully as waste. The workers closest to the danger understood more than the people outside the fences, but even inside, knowledge had limits. There were things engineers knew, things managers knew, things security officers knew, and things only the state would allow itself to know. And beneath all of it, one problem was growing heavier by the month: what to do with the most dangerous waste. Some radioactive waste had already gone into the river, but not all of it could be handled that way forever. High-level waste was stored in tanks, contained, monitored, and in theory controlled. But controlled is a dangerous word in places built too quickly. It can mean safe, or it can mean merely postponed. By the early 1950s, Mayak had underground waste storage tanks set inside reinforced concrete structures. These tanks contained highly radioactive liquid waste, which produced heat through radioactive decay and therefore required cooling. The 1957 disaster would later be traced to a failure in one of those cooling systems. Imagine that for a moment. You build a secret machine to fuel an empire's ambition. That machine creates material too dangerous to leave exposed. So you seal the danger underground, inside steel and concrete, and tell yourself it is under control. But the waste is alive in its own terrible way. It heats itself. It changes. It presses against time. It asks for vigilance every hour of every day. The moment vigilance weakens, disaster starts counting. Some failures are dramatic. A valve bursts. A fire starts. Alarms ring. Men run. This one was different. One of the waste tanks lost effective cooling. The failure was not repaired in time. The material inside continued to heat. The temperature rose slowly, invisibly, relentlessly. Days passed. Then weeks. Perhaps people worried. Perhaps some people noticed signs and filed reports. Perhaps some trusted that the problem would be dealt with. That is often how large systems die, not from one moment of stupidity, but from many small decisions, each one choosing not to stop the machine. Outside, autumn approached. The villagers prepared for colder weather. Crops were gathered. Wood was stacked. Smoke rose from chimneys. In the secret city, work shifts continued. Trucks moved through controlled gates. Men in uniforms checked papers. Children returned from school. Somewhere inside the facility, clocks ticked on walls above desks where routine paperwork was completed by people who could not imagine that history was bending beneath their feet. The waste inside the tank did not care about routine. As liquid evaporated and temperatures climbed, the chemical composition of the stored material became more dangerous. The tank was no longer just a container. It had become a trap. The energy gathering within it was not the spectacular chain reaction people associate with atomic bombs. That is part of what makes this event so misunderstood. The Kyshtym Disaster was not a nuclear detonation. It was a catastrophic chemical explosion involving highly radioactive waste, but the difference means very little to the villages that lay in its path. For the people who would suffer, definitions did not matter. Only consequences did. And yet, On the eve of the disaster, nobody living by the river could have described what was about to happen. They did not know there was a tank. They did not know it was hot. They did not know a cooling system had failed. They did not know that somewhere inside one of the Soviet Union's most secret industrial zones, danger had been gathering in silence for so long that it had almost become patient. There is something uniquely terrifying about a hidden catastrophe approaching ordinary people who are still behaving ordinarily. A mother folding clothes. A child chasing a dog through wet grass. A worker lighting a cigarette outside a concrete building. An old man watching the sky darken over the fields. A train moving somewhere in the distance. A guard checking a clipboard at the gate. A scientist telling himself the numbers can wait until morning. Then comes the day. September 29, 1957. A Sunday. The tank that had been heating for so long finally crossed the threshold between danger and release. The stored waste exploded with a force commonly described in the range of dozens of tons of TNT equivalent. A massive concrete lid was blown aside. Radioactive material was hurled upward into the air. Dust and debris rose over the site, and a plume of contamination began moving across the landscape. Later descriptions identified this contaminated path as the East Ural Radioactive Trace, stretching across thousands of square kilometers. But in the first instant, none of the grand labels existed. There was only the blast, only shock, only the beginning of a cloud that could not be seen for what it truly was. At Mayak, people close enough to the site would have known something terrible had happened. Structures were damaged. Systems were thrown into chaos. Orders were shouted. Confusion spread through the chain of command. But just beyond that zone, the true horror was still invisible. The contamination moved with the wind, and the land received it without protest. Fields, roads, roofs, trees, water, soil, everything waited under the same sky as the plume drifted onward. By evening, the world had changed, but only a few people knew it. Somewhere in a nearby village, a family may have sat down to dinner while the first particles were already settling outside. Somewhere else, someone may have looked out a window and noticed nothing unusual at all. That is how part 1 of the story ends. Not with the disaster fully understood, not even with the victims warned, but with the cloud already moving, with a poisoned wind crossing a quiet land, and with thousands of people still living inside an ordinary night, unaware that history had already entered their homes. Invisible Radiation, the secret story of Mayak and the Kyshtym Disaster. Part 2 of the cloud, the silence, and the bare truth. The most merciless disasters are not always the ones that kill immediately. Sometimes the cruelest ones are those that leave enough time for confusion. Enough time for people to keep drinking the water. Enough time for children to keep playing outdoors. Enough time for governments to choose secrecy over warning. When the tank exploded at Mayak on September 29, 1957, the blast itself was only the beginning. What followed was not a firestorm the world could watch on film. It was something quieter, colder, and in many ways more haunting. A radioactive plume moving across villages, forests, roads, and farms while the state struggled to contain not just contamination, but information. The accident contaminated the large area later called the East Ural Radioactive Trace, and more than 10,000 people were eventually evacuated from affected settlements. Broader impact estimates run much higher. Imagine waking the next morning in the countryside east of the facility. The air is calm. The house is the same. The trees are still there. The hens still scratch the dirt. The road still runs between the same fences. The world does not look broken. And yet, it has already been altered. That is the terror of radioactive contamination. It does not need to transform the visible world right away. It can settle into it. The danger becomes part of the environment before human beings even realize they should be afraid. People think survival depends on seeing the threat. In truth, some threats become deadliest precisely because they can hide inside normality. In the affected settlements, daily life did not stop the instant the explosion happened. It could not. People had no reason to understand why the state had not told them. In some places, the authorities delayed evacuation. According to historical accounts, evacuation operations for some villages began about a week later, while other communities were relocated much later still. That delay is one of the defining moral wounds of the disaster. The contamination moved faster than the truth. It is easy, decades later, to say that everyone should have been warned immediately. But immediate warning requires a system willing to admit weakness, and Mayak existed inside a state built on controlled information. This was not just a factory. It was part of a military nuclear program. To reveal the scale of the accident was to reveal vulnerability. To reveal vulnerability was to threaten prestige. And in systems where prestige matters more than people, silence becomes policy. So silence spread. Officials appeared. Orders were given. Some residents were told to leave, but not fully told why. Others stayed in place as if nothing irreversible had happened. Somewhere, livestock grazed on contaminated ground. Somewhere, people gathered crops from tainted soil. Somewhere, children touched fences dusted with particles they could not see. Even when evacuations began, many families were not handed truth. They were handed instructions. Pack your belongings. No, do not ask too many questions. Try to imagine that kind of displacement. You have lived in the same village your entire life. You know which road floods in spring and which field dries first in summer. You know where your parents are buried. You know the sound the river makes in early thaw. Then one day the state arrives and tells you to leave, but not to understand. You are asked to obey catastrophe without being allowed to name it. Some villages vanish this way not through flood, not through war, but through invisible contamination and official erasure. Houses were abandoned. Wells were left behind. Fences leaned into empty yards. The map changed quietly. At the medical level, the damage was uneven, difficult to track, and made even harder to interpret because the state controlled so much of the information. Exposure levels varied depending on location, timing, work, diet, water use, and proximity to contaminated areas. Some people became acutely ill. Others did not know they had been harmed until years later. Later research documented chronic radiation exposure in populations affected by both the Techa River releases and the 1957 accident, though precise death tolls remain debated and difficult to pin down with certainty. That uncertainty has a human cost of its own. When a disaster is hidden, the victims are robbed twice. First, they are robbed by the exposure itself. Then they are robbed by doubt. Was the sickness connected? Was the weakness coincidence? Was the cancer random? Was the child's condition fate? Was the soil ever truly safe again? The body asks questions that politics refuses to answer. And still the state protected the secret. Outside the Soviet Union, there was no immediate global recognition of what had happened at Kyshtym. There were rumors. There were scattered reports. There were hints that some radioactive event had taken place, but the full shape of the disaster remained obscured. The Soviet government did not publicly acknowledge the accident for decades. Broad official acknowledgement only came in 1989. In the meantime, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history lived in the shadows, spoken of vaguely and completely, or not at all. Think about the scale of that silence. An entire contaminated landscape, evacuated communities, long-term health consequences, a poisoned regional history, and yet no open confession. This is one of the reasons the Kyshtym disaster feels so different from Chernobyl in public memory. Chernobyl erupted into the television age. It became visual. It crossed borders in a way the world could measure almost in real time. But Kyshtym belonged to an earlier and darker model of state secrecy. It was hidden behind military infrastructure, censorship, and geography. It happened in a place that itself had been hidden. Even the city connected to the plant Chelyabinsk-40, later Chelyabinsk-65, now Ozyorsk, had lived under controlled identity. The disaster inherited that same invisibility. But truth is patient. Even in closed systems it leaks. Years passed. The Soviet Union maintained its silence. Yet fragments emerged. Observers noticed unusual restrictions in parts of the southern Urals. Scientists and dissidents pieced together clues. Testimony accumulated. Eventually, the exiled Soviet biologist Joseph Medvedev played a crucial role in bringing the story to wider international attention in the 1970s, arguing that a major nuclear accident had taken place in the Urals years earlier. At first, many doubted him, but the core of his account was later borne out. There is something tragic in that too. A disaster so effectively hidden that when someone finally tells the truth, the world hesitates to believe him. That hesitation reveals the second invisible cloud in this story. Not radiation, it's belief. The Mayak disaster was difficult to grasp because it challenged the assumptions people wanted to keep. It suggested that the state pursuing nuclear parity at all costs might also be willing to contaminate its own land and conceal the consequences. It suggested that waste-boring, technical, unglamorous waste could produce devastation on a historic scale. And it suggested that history might already contain a major nuclear tragedy long before the one the world thought was first. That challenge mattered, because Kyshtym was not merely an industrial accident. It was a warning about systems. A warning about what happens when technology outruns ethics. When military urgency outruns environmental caution. When secrecy outruns responsibility. When the people living nearest danger are the last to be trusted with truth. And perhaps the deepest horror is this: the 1957 explosion was not the true beginning of the suffering around Mayak. The region had already endured years of contamination from earlier waste disposal into the Techa River, meaning that the blast did not create the disaster from nothing. It intensified and exposed a larger pattern of neglect. In that sense, Kyshtym was both a sudden catastrophe and the consequence of a slower one. That is why this story should not be told as a single afternoon of failure. It should be told as a chain. One decision leads to another. One shortcut becomes standard practice. One secret justifies another. One contaminated river prepares the ground for a wider contamination zone. One system built to protect the state becomes a system willing to sacrifice the people inside it. And then, one day, the chain snaps loud enough for history to hear. Today, the Kyshtym disaster is generally classified as an EASE Level 6, a serious accident, placing it among the gravest nuclear events ever recorded and below only the Level 7 disasters of Chernobyl and Fukushima on that scale. It is often described as the only widely recognized Level 6 event. That classification matters because it reminds us that this was not a footnote. It was not a regional mishap. It was one of the great nuclear disasters of the modern age. And yet so many people have never heard of it. Maybe that is because memory is political. The tragedies that are photographed, televised, admitted, and argued over become part of public consciousness more easily. The tragedies that are denied, classified, buried in bureaucracy, and hidden in remote landscapes require extra effort to remember. Kyshtym was deprived of immediate memory. It had to be reconstructed later, piece by piece, through documents, testimony, contamination studies, and the stubborn refusal of some people to let silence win. The human landscape left behind by such a disaster is hard to describe fully. There are abandoned places, yes. There are contaminated zones, yes. There are technical reports and exposure models and maps of fallout. But beyond all that, there is something more intimate. There is the mother who never received a proper explanation. There is the villager who was told to leave home without being told what home had become. There is the worker who understood enough to be afraid but not enough to change the system. There is the child who drank from the river before anyone said the word radiation aloud. There is the old man who watched officials measure fields where he had once planted food. A nuclear tragedy is never only about atoms. It is also about trust. And Kyshtym shattered trust at every level. Trust in the land. Trust in the water. Trust in authority. Trust in modern progress. Trust in the idea that if something truly terrible happened, someone would surely tell the truth. But sometimes they do not. Sometimes the truth comes 20 years late. Sometimes 30. Sometimes only after the state that buried it begins to weaken. By the time the Soviet authorities openly acknowledged the Kyshtym disaster in 1989, the event was already part of a much larger pattern of revealed nuclear secrecy. Chernobyl had already happened. The political climate had begun to change. The old reflex of total denial was harder to maintain. But acknowledgement after decades is not justice. It is only proof that secrecy has limits. So what does Mayak mean now? It means that some of the worst disasters in history begin long before the headline date attached to them. It means that contamination can be both environmental and moral. It means that waste is not a side note to power. It is power's shadow, and if ignored, that shadow grows large enough to swallow entire communities. It means that human beings can build reactors, process plutonium, classify cities, and lock away records, but they cannot finally command what radiation will do once it is released into the world. And above all, it means this. Before Chernobyl, there was another nuclear nightmare. One hidden in a city that did not officially exist. one fed by a poisoned river, one carried by a cloud that drifted over people who did not know they were standing in its path, one buried under decades of silence, one remembered today not only because of the explosion, but because of everything that made the explosion possible. The story of Mayak and the Kyshtym disaster is not just the story of an accident, it is the story of a state trying to outrun consequence, the story of nature forced to carry a secret, the story of ordinary people left defenseless against an invisible enemy, the story of truth arriving too late for many who needed it most. And perhaps that is why this tragedy still feels so chilling, because it does not belong entirely to the past. Every age creates new powers it barely understands. Every government is tempted by secrecy when secrecy protects prestige. Every technological system produces waste, risk, and consequences someone would rather postpone. Mayak is what happens when postponement becomes policy. Kyshtym is what happens when silence becomes part of the machine. And the invisible radiation that drifted across that land in 1957 still leaves behind a final warning for the rest of us. A disaster does not need to be seen to be real. A poisoned place does not need to be named to be suffering. And the truth, even buried for decades, never becomes harmless just because it was hidden.